if someone is making 90,000 or 100,000 and they're spending close to 90,000 or 100,000, at the end of the year, they have nothing left. So, they're putting a lot of their, blood, sweat, and tears out into the world, but they're really not having anything left over to ultimately end up achieving that opportunity to spend their time and their effort and their energy as they want to.
What does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit in that? We tackle those questions and others in the School of Financial Freedom podcast. We talk about the role of money in our personal growth and spiritual liberation, the concrete math of budgeting and saving and investing, and how all this relates to the life you were meant to lead. Each episode is an interview with a former student of my online course, Financial Freedom 1, where they explain their favorite lesson and years later, what financial, behavioral, and spiritual impact it had on them. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of School of Financial Freedom, and your host. Glad you're here. Hi, I'm super excited to have Kim and Paul here today because they're doing one of the core lessons in Financial Freedom 1. And one of the lessons that they're particularly well-suited to talk about. This is a very special couple to me for reasons that you'll find out very, very soon.
Hi, my name is Kim LaFever.
And I'm Paul Spencer.
And this is the School of Financial Freedom podcast.
Kim, Paul, introduce yourselves.
All right, well,
go for it.
Yeah. Let me just start by saying we're a married couple in our late 50s who took financial freedom about 6 or 7 years ago. A lot has changed for us since taking it. I mean, just about everything. When we took financial freedom, we were living in Portland, Oregon and working a lot.
And now we're living in Spain and only working when we feel like it.
So in essence, you're actually the first couple of my students who have reached financial freedom. And so I'm super excited to talk about your lives since you reached financial freedom, how you got there, and what are the struggles that you're having afterwards. But you chose lesson 1.4, which I'm super grateful for. 1.4 is about the savings rate and when you want financial freedom. So let's start with just talking about the lesson. What's in the lesson? Pretend you're talking to someone who hasn't read the lesson yet.
Okay, I'll start if that's all right. This lesson on when do you want financial freedom was a great conversation for us to have because I think the answer for most people is as soon as effing possible. I mean, when we took financial freedom, we didn't have a super clear answer to this question, except that we knew that we wanted to have the ability to decide more of what, how, and where we spent our time. And at the time, that seemed like something that was in the distant future.
And so this lesson was particularly interesting for us because it really made it concrete and clear that we were, in fact, in control of when we could achieve financial freedom. And the lesson is all about, well, to me, the key takeaway from the lesson is that you should be running your life as a business. And it doesn't matter how much money you make. That's irrelevant. What matters is how much profit you make. How much do you save after your expenditure? And the lesson goes into quite a lot of detail about the consequences of your saving rate as a percentage of your income and what that means. If you're saving only 5% of your income, then basically you're never going to retire. You're going to have to work for the rest of your life. But the more you increase that saving rate, the quicker you can achieve financial freedom.
Yeah.
So, stop there. I mean, that's a great summary so far. I'm just super curious. What did you think before taking the class?
For me, at least, I hadn't put anything concrete behind it. I mean, Kim and I were already saving money. We had jobs. We were maxing out our 401ks, things like that. But it had always seemed retirement, to use the more, I guess, the older term, seemed like something that was at some point in the future. You know, you work until you're 65 or whatever, and then you retire. And maybe if you save well, you might be able to accelerate that a little bit. But it was very kind of amorphous like that. And it was only when we took this class that I realized that no, you have control over it. It can be in a set number of years, and that number is very dependent on how you manage your life and your expenditure and your income in the meantime.
Kim, any comments on that?
Yeah, when I think about this lesson and going through this period in our lives, even though we had, full disclosure here, quite ample income at the time, we also spent a lot. So seeing it more like graphic detail of, if we were saving at a higher percentage rate than we had been, that it was going to accelerate the opportunity for us to achieve financial freedom. It's just a massive unlock, right? For realizing how much we didn't have to wait for some arbitrary or conceptual ideal of, achieve a certain age milestone or something, and then suddenly you have more control over your time. So,
yeah, what I love is, on some level, it's super obvious, right? The more you save, the less you'll have to work. And at the same time, it seems like taking this course together and this lesson specifically gave you permission to think in a different way about your lives.
I think that's true. It gave us permission. It gave us the opportunity. I again had thought the way I did about retirement being something off in the future because that's how people always kind of talked about it. This course really opened my eyes to the fact that it doesn't have to be that way. And as you say, it gave me permission and the tools. And this is part of what was so important about it, the tools to take that control.
Yeah. You talk about how this lesson specifically with all the numbers made it concrete. Can you talk about the numbers and how the numbers work out?
Yeah, I'll talk about that. For example, right, you use an example in the lesson that talks about when somebody makes $30,000 a year and they spend $20,000, right? They're earning $10,000 because they have $10,000 left over at the end of the year. So that's their profit. If someone is making $90,000 or $100,000 and they're spending close to $90,000 or $100,000, at the end of the year, they have nothing left. So, they're putting a lot of their, blood, sweat, and tears out into the world, but they're really not having anything left over to ultimately end up achieving that opportunity to spend their time and their effort and their energy as they want to.
So,
and the lesson goes into percentages. Again, I think I mentioned that if I recall the lesson correctly, if you're only saving 5%, then you will not be able to afford to retire. But if you can save 50%, you can achieve financial freedom in 16 years. And a 65% saving rate means it would be just over 10 years. So you really can accelerate things.
And I think being able to see that in the lesson, in the graphs, this is material that, if one were looking for it, they can find it on the internet. But, it was, I think, partly having that content kind of brought together in a cohesive way, right? To be able to see it. That's once you can see it, it's almost like, it's not imaginary anymore. And then it's like, wait a minute, if other people can do that, we can do that. What would it take, right, for us to do some of those things? So, as I mentioned before, for us, the big thing was we weren't going to go get extra jobs or try to necessarily go for more earnings because we had pretty good earnings. We really saw the opportunity for us was decreasing expense, making some decisions that, selling our bigger house in a nicer, a more desirable, popular, whatever neighborhood, and moving to a smaller house that was a bit further out that still gave us a lot of the things that we wanted from the city and also allowed us to keep more of our money.
So talk about the number 25x.
You want to take that?
Yeah. So The number 25x is important because The basic rule of 25 is that you need 25 times your annual consumption or expenditure in order to achieve financial independence. And then once you've achieved that, you can withdraw. The flip side of that 25 is you can withdraw 4% of your retirement savings every year and have your investments meet that withdrawal rate.
Right. So
people talk about crossing over, right? Whether they choose to actually activate that and maybe, change what they're doing or stop working at that time is up to them. However, being able to see that or get to that point where you achieve that and you say, wow, those graphs are crossing over now. If I want to, right, I could keep working for a while. Maybe I would like to have more money in my future. Or maybe what's important to me is having my time, right? And knowing that I can spend within the rate that I have set. I mean, things could change, of course, but within that rate that I've set down and have been maybe living to already, and knowing that this 25X allows for me to continue to do that without working if I want to, it's really huge.
Yeah, it's interesting. And to be clear, like the 25X just allows you to have enough passive income to meet your monthly or annual expenses. And so there are other ways to get to that. Like, for example, a lot of the way I have financial freedom is that I have renters in my house. And the passive income from the house helps meet my monthly expenses. So ultimately, the goal is passive income equals monthly expenses. But 25X is the traditional way to get there. So yeah, that's a great summation of the lesson. Anything else you want to bring out into the lesson before we get in? Yeah.
Just a couple of concrete examples that come from the lesson, just so people can wrap their head around real numbers, real people, right? If you spend $20,000 a year, how much nest egg do you need, right? For this 25X, $500,000 in assets and investments. If you spend $100,000.
Just to let you know, Kim, that's essentially me. I spend around $25,000 a year. So my nest egg that I needed was much smaller, but go ahead.
And so if you, spend $100,000 a year, you're going to need 2.5 million to have that 25X. So for some people, that number might be more than 100. For some people, it might be somewhere between the 20,000 and 100. The math makes it easy to see, though, like once you start to look at it. And I think I would like to just say something about that, once you see it or once you're able to look at it, because I know that, one of the big things that we would hope that everyone would take away from financial freedom, especially as you're embarking on the early lessons, is that at first looking at this material and especially kind of assessing how you think you're doing, whether you're saving enough or making enough or spending, all these things, it can feel sort of it's right or it's wrong or it's not enough. So anyone who is willing to even look and start looking and start thinking in this way, and then, of course, anybody who then ultimately takes some action towards that, huge round of applause, because, there are, as you teach in, I think it's the first lesson, right? We all come into this and carry with us money stories and money scripts. So sometimes being able to look at our underwear, maybe be seen in it takes a certain amount of courage.
Paul, any comments?
Well, first of all, I absolutely agree with that. It's uncomfortable, and I can give you a concrete example of that that's relevant to this lesson. As Kim said, we pretty quickly realized that the opportunity for us to accelerate financial freedom came from reducing our spending, increasing our profit by reducing our expenses. So that meant figuring out what our expenses were, tracking them, analyzing them by categories. So, there are plenty of tools that enable you to look at how much you spend by a given category: housing costs, groceries, utilities, dining out, etc. And we pretty quickly realized that there was some discretionary spending going on that really didn't need to go on. It was just habit. And, an example, we were both in jobs where we were working a lot, kind of high pressure jobs. And we'd get home from work and didn't feel like cooking, so we'd just wander down to the local restaurant and have dinner and a couple of glasses of wine. And before you know it, it's Wednesday night, you've dropped $80 on dinner. You keep doing that, it jacks your expenses up pretty quickly. And so it was kind of an uncomfortable thing to realize that we were not, to be blunt, managing our money as well as we thought we were.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about like when you become intentional about financial freedom, you become intentional about your spending, and ultimately you become intentional about the way you live your life.
Exactly.
It seems like these changes also, these financial changes in your budgeting created some positive changes just generally in how you live your life.
Oh, absolutely. After we did the work, through the financial freedom course, after we did that work, felt like, we tend to be idea people. And, we kind of went through some periods of like, hey, if we wanted to try and do this differently, right, and not just live out the financial plan that we had put in place with our financial advisor some years ago, which, had us going further into the future before we would be crossed over, uh, we can be in the driver's seat, but we have to be kind of open and willing and look at some things. So we decided to look at the possibility of exploring living in another first world country. And, we had some criteria around that. Like we wanted a place that had high quality, affordable healthcare with a lower cost of living. So we weren't, there are cheaper places that we could live than the one we chose, but we wanted to be near Europe ideally so that we could travel and do some other things. So, not everyone would choose that, right? Like for us, it was, we were going to kind of pick up some stakes, and in September 2020, that's what we did, right? We moved to Spain, but not everyone would do that. Some people will want something else. They might want, to leave a legacy for, family, or we're less concerned about that. So for us, it was more about, our life, our time, how we're spending it, where we're spending it, and what could we do to make some of those things happen sooner.
I'll go back to when you took the course. Did you set like a runway or a time frame for when you would want to hit financial freedom? And did you hit it?
We never set a specific number runway. It was more of, as Kim said, the answer is as soon as we can. And so it was more about driving towards that. And then I think we did get to a point where we looked at some options, like Kim said, one of them being, what if we were to live somewhere with a lower cost of living? And then doing the numbers, realizing that this could happen within a few years, not 10 or 15 years down the road. And that just gave us extra motivation to do the work and commit to, not just going out to dinner on Wednesday night because we felt like it.
Yeah, and I also think in terms of, looking at the years, the number, maybe at the time that we did this lesson, even though I know in this lesson we are asked to project a number, right, to work to figure it out. I think by this point, we were still a little bit in the world of, well, we have this financial plan that we've been working against with a financial advisor from a large financial institution for some time. And if that seems like it will, it'll basically come to fruition at the time that it will come to fruition, barring some kind of, major catastrophe, right? So I think there was a certain amount of like, well, we could just do that, right? And then I think as we continue to go through the course, I know that by the time we got to the end and we did videos, declarations, I said in my video that within 2 or 3 years, I think I said, we're going to be living in Spain or Portugal. So, some of those things started to come as hey, there are some options and there are some levers here and we can pull them. So we did some of that iteratively, right? Like downsizing in Portland to a different place, doing the research about what would be possible, moving somewhere else, renting our house out in Portland, identifying a program that exists where we ultimately ended up moving to in Spain that allowed us to be teaching assistants the first year that we were here. So we got paid a little bit of a stipend, which also made it a bit more palatable. It's like, hey, we're going to go try this thing out somewhere else. They're going to pay us a bit of money to do that, which is always better than just spending your own money. And, over time, at some point, we realized we're not just trying it out and this isn't just a sabbatical. We're going to keep going.
And because we've done the work, we could.
Well, it seems like the course gave you, it was like an active imagination, right? Like you had never imagined you could do this. And then you started imagining, and then you were able to creatively to just execute it.
Yeah. And like I said before, I think there were, not just in this lesson, but in the course generally, for me, there were some significant conceptual shifts. Kim mentioned the whole money story thing, and I mentioned that I had always thought the way things worked is you work for a set number of years, you reach a set age, and at that point you can retire. And this course made me realize that it doesn't have to be that way. And if you think about things differently, again, the example I used earlier of instead of focusing on income, and if I got a better job and made more money, well, what if I made the same amount of money and spent less? That achieves the same thing.
Yeah, your time is free once, you're not giving it away or selling it, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I guess in a sense you could say like, okay, the $80 dinner, how much do I have to work for that to get it? And how many of those equate to a year's or 5 years being able to use my time any way I want sooner versus delaying it until,
and
some arbitrary date.
Yeah. And you, by examining some of these things, you learn, you realize things about yourself that you hadn't really realized before. So another example would be, I've always been the sort of people who's probably been a little more judgmental than I should about other people, and particularly guys who spend a lot of money on high fashion clothes and things like that. It's like, come on, guys, that's a waste. And never really gave any second thought to the fact that I actually spent quite a lot of money on nice cars. And it was only when we started doing this work and looking at what we do with our money and our expenses that I realized, I did spend this much on a car and I don't need a car that costs that much.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the other lessons is about like personal finance is pretty commonsensical, right? In fact, I always say there's only two numbers you need to know: how much you're earning and how much you spend, and everything else flows from there. But I think, and everyone knows that, right? But I think actually diving in one and maybe even two levels deeper gives you a real sense of what's possible in your life. I always say that personal finance is your relationship with the future, and Kim and Paul 7 years ago did something for present Kim and Paul.
Very much so. I mean, before we took financial freedom, there's no way we'd have ended up doing what we're doing now without having taken it.
I was just going to say, it's been such a important influence and inspiration in our lives that I think it was a couple of years ago now, my nephew, who's 30, we said, we had this experience. We really wished that we had had this much earlier in our lives. Would you be interested in taking the course? And he was. So he went through financial freedom. And this December, he called me and he said, oh, hey, I just wanted to let you know my after-tax savings rate for the year was 38%. And I thought, you go, man. That's good. That's some good work.
Yeah, that means he'll probably be done with working in about 20 years, if my math is right.
Right. Your math is right. And I believe he was doing some saving prior to that. He's a little bit that way. I just think that this opened his eyes to, just how much more, is available to him if he's willing to just do the work.
So, all right. Well, the two of you are my first students who have crossed over. So tell us what's life like on the other side.
It's great. I mean, it's not It's been an interesting journey, I think, because it was hard for us both, and still is sometimes, to have so much free time because we'd always been busy people in jobs where we work long hours. And all of a sudden you wake up and your time is your own. And okay, what do I do with it now? Because the other thing is we're very active people. We're not the sort of people whose idea of a great retirement is sleep in and do nothing and just sit on the couch or go sit at a cafe or whatever. We need intellectual stimulation, engagement, and rewarding ways to pass our time. And at times it's been a challenge to find that, but I think we're doing a lot better at it now.
I think we're doing much better. At first I mean, especially since with our financial freedom, we also chose to move to another country. And so there were lots of, there's a lot of excitement, right, associated with that. You're on a high at first, like, oh, this is so awesome. I'm having all these new experiences, this, that, and the other. Then at some point, after a while, starts to set in that some things that maybe I didn't always, I mean, I always knew that I enjoyed working. So let's just be, I'm not going to bullshit you. I do. Like, I really enjoy working. And when I wasn't doing it as much, I certainly enjoy having some flexibility around whether I would work or take an assignment, or not. But I missed it, right? I found that level of engagement and that camaraderie, that occurs with people in a workplace and was something that was just sort of lacking for me. And so I've done a bit of, remote consulting. And, of course, I've come to the realization that just because I don't have to work doesn't mean I can't. And it's a little bit trickier because of where we live. But that's just a creative problem to be solved.
Yeah, Vicki Robin talks about the difference between a job and the work of your life. And one of the things she says is like a job provides all sorts of things other than income, like structure, a sense of purpose, clear identity, community, status. Like both of you had pretty high paying jobs. And when you stop working at a job, you lose a lot of those things and you have to find ways to replace those things.
Yeah. And like I say, I think we're getting better at it. So, for example, for me, I always used to write for a hobby, but I never had much time to do it before. So I'd had a couple of short stories published, but nothing significant. But now I've finished a novel. It's been bought by a publisher. It comes out on May 23rd of this year, and I'm currently working on the sequel.
Amazing. Paul, what's the name of it so people can know?
It's called Black Mark. It's a crime novel set in our old town of Portland, Oregon, against the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter protests a few years ago.
Amazing. When is it coming out again?
May 23rd.
All right. Well, I'll have to drop a link in when it does come out.
For sure.
Kim, what have you been doing?
Oh, well, what I've been doing. So, like I mentioned before, I've done a bit of remote consulting. I think the big things, though, in the last year have been more creative pursuits. So I started working with a singing coach last year, and I've really enjoyed using that expressive part of myself. I tend to be very tribal by nature. So, okay, maybe social. But I also like to have depth in my relationships. And so, I mean, some of what I do, I have regular commitments to some of my friends and family back in the US, and I, work to keep in contact with them. I've been working on building community here, just getting to know people, trying to find and create a tribe. And recently I started volunteering at a cat shelter, which has been interesting. I never really kind of thought that that's the type of volunteer work that I might do. But what I am enjoying about it is that there's plenty of work to do there. And I don't mind certain types of grunt work. If I kind of just focus myself on the purpose, like what am I here for? Why am I doing this? I just get in there with my, crew of people and we clean litter boxes and feed cats and figure out who's sick. And I don't know. There's something about that I just have been finding more rewarding than I would have imagined.
And to be clear, you're both finding financial freedom enjoyable, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's just no comparison to the old days of, the alarm clock goes off at 6 and you have to get up and quickly bolt down breakfast and go to the gym and rush through a workout and then work a long day and come home exhausted and make dinner. And by the time you've done that and eaten dinner and cleaned up, it's 8:30 or so. And in a couple of hours, you've got to go to bed and do it again. Now, I mean, another example of freedom. Kim and I both enjoy playing golf, but we hardly ever played golf in Portland. Admittedly, some of the year that's because of how the weather is in Portland, but even in the good weather, we just didn't have time. Now I'm part of a golf society here. I play every Wednesday.
Yeah, and I play a bit less often. I'm happy, right? I'm happy that we have achieved this point in our lives and that we have this flexibility. And, I will say it has been rocky, right? At times, like just there have been times when I have felt a little bit adrift, right? Like, because I get to choose the direction. And, in the past, I think a lot of times the direction just seems to be you're just in the current. You're kind of going with the current in many, many cases. I think another thing that I thought was important to bring up in this lesson, or for anybody, who's thinking about this, and that is that, when we first came to Spain, we came with savings, and that's, not investments, savings, none of that, right? It was just some savings that we had put together to try out this experience. And then after we decided to stay, and more recently, we realized that in order to fund our life here for the longer term, we needed to start taking some modest withdrawals from my retirement account in particular, mostly because I'm the one who's 59 and a half. I'm 60 recently. And that really brought up a lot of emotion for me, because you go through, if you're doing this even remotely the way most people do it, you go through a good portion of your life saying, you got to save for the future, you got to save for the future, and you can't touch it. And then suddenly it's like, oh, you're going to touch some of the money. You're like, but you can't touch that money.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way, Kim. Like, and I actually know a lot of people in the FIRE movement feel the same way. Like, you spend, a couple decades of your life working furiously to create a savings rate, and then all of a sudden you hit financial freedom. And you're told, like, you don't actually have to work anymore. And that's actually an uncomfortable moment, because all of a sudden you're not making more money than you spend. In theory, you're making as much money through passive income as you're spending, so you're netting out zero. But at some point, you can actually start doing a drawdown, and being in the red is actually a pretty uncomfortable moment.
Yeah, I think what Kim said absolutely rings true for me. We both had some discomfort about taking money out of our retirement savings and spending it. We're getting better. It's only been a couple months, 3 months, I think, since we started doing that. And, we've had conversations with a financial planner about the situation, and that it's fine to withdraw this amount of money each month. Your, Monte Carlo simulation shows a 97% confidence level, etc. So it's taken a little bit of a mental shift and time and getting comfortable with it. But I think we're pretty close now to the point where we realize, this is what we worked so hard for so long. And this financial freedom it's great. It sure beats the alternative.
Yeah, it's interesting, because to get nerdy about the math a little bit, 25x, if you run enough of the simulations, will last you through perpetuity, right? Like, and depends on your margin of safety, but like maybe 97% of the time, right? But that means 97% of the time you die with 25x, which means, if Vicki Robin's right that money is life energy, we have left life on the table when we die, and that we should sacrifice a little security so that we can have a little bit more life.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I mean, Kim alluded to this earlier. We don't have kids, so we don't have to worry about leaving a legacy for them or anything like that. So our number is slightly different. It's not 25x, because we don't want to die with leaving that
Amount of money.
Leaving that amount of money there unused, unlived, if you will. So we have a slightly different drawdown rate, but there's still a buffer in there, and unless we live to a very old age, we will still leave some money behind, because, of course, the other side of that coin is you don't want to wake up one morning at the age of 75 and be in great health and have no money.
Right. Yeah.
So we've still left a bit of a buffer, but it's not the 25x number.
And you're pointing out to something really key in this phrase, good health, because what you did is you front-ended life energy in your 50s, where you actually have better health than you'll have in 20 years from now.
Yeah, exactly. Enjoy it while you can. I think that's one of the great blessings for us of financial freedom, of having done the course and having got to the position we are, is that we are young enough and healthy enough that we can do a lot of these things that we're doing now. And we're not of an age where, I'd love to be able to play golf every week, but I can't because my back's no good anymore,
Yeah, and I would
Right.
say, we're creative people and we're data people. So, we love the opportunities to, think creatively about life and how we might spend it. But like, we love seeing a model, right? If somebody can show us the model that can enable that, those two things in combination for us are magic. We're like, okay, we could see how that can apply to us. Let's go after that. But we rarely go just on the creative. And we get bored if we stick to the data a little too much.
Yeah, and I think that's why this lesson is particularly good for the two of you, because it gave you the numbers, the concrete data of what's possible.
Yeah, so when I speak to the data, I think it was where I read this. I don't know if this is the source, but I will attribute it to Mr. Money Mustache, I think, in a blog post or something about the 60 the years that you have before you're 60 are the most vital and vibrant years that you will likely have in your life. So why shift, why if it's possible, why not have more of that time to use as you would like versus other things maybe just potentially taking over as you get a bit older, and then you don't have those choices anymore.
Yeah, Kim, like I crossed over when I was 42. And I tell the story elsewhere, but part of the reason I crossed over is because I grew up with my aunt and uncle, and in 2015, my uncle had ALS, and I got laid off at the same time. And his last pieces of advice, his last words of advice for me were, "Don't wait for anything." He said, "I'd waited my entire life to do things. I can't do them anymore." And I knew what he was talking about. Like, he was born in Hong Kong, and our family had fled the communists, and so he had never stepped foot in China, and he'd been waiting for retirement to step foot in China. He never gone to Europe. He wanted to take my aunt to Europe. Never went to Europe after, watching decades of Rick Steves' Europe. um, and he died at age 64. And when he died, I just realized, you don't get this life back. And that's the whole thing about financial freedom. And so crossing over at 42 was this idea that, yeah, you're right. Like, your best years and your most likely years are the years 40 and 50. You're not guaranteed anything at any time, but the odds lower over time.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm curious, I think we all recognize that you were in a pretty privileged place of, you both had high incomes, you both had done savings, and you took this course early 50s. What would you tell someone who's like much earlier, like in their 20s or 30s, that they're so far away, they're having trouble imagining what you're talking about?
Good question. I think the first thing I would say is, it seems like it's so far away, but this course will show you that it's a lot closer than you think it is if you do a few simple things. And that would be energizing to just about anybody. I mean, Kim referred to her nephew before. And when we first talked to him about this class, you could see the excitement on his face. And I think people, when they realize, A, that they have control, and B, that crossover date can be a lot earlier than they thought it was, that's enough to get them engaged.
Yeah, there's a part of me that says, don't show this to anybody who hasn't worked for at least a few years. And then once they've worked for a few years, they'll be like, oh, this isn't maybe what, in many cases, this is not what it was cracked up to be. This is not what I thought I went to college for. And then they're ripe, right? It's like, okay, if you look at this and you consider what this affords you potentially, and you, in many cases, get to decide, right? Go for it.
I don't have the answer for you, but two of the big uh, pieces of pushback I get from younger people is, number one, they don't trust the system, right? Like, they don't trust that the system is going to be there, that they'll ever retire. And there's just a sense of despair. So address that one first. Any thoughts about despair? Because I think of both of you as pretty hopeful, optimistic people.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad news out there. And I totally see why younger people might feel that way, because a lot of the things that, frankly, we probably won't live to see come to pass could well come to pass in their lifetimes, whether it's some of the worst consequences of climate change, for example. But again, I come back to the piece about not trusting the system. You don't need to trust the system. And again, that's one of the things that financial freedom teaches you. You are not at the mercy of the system. You have control.
I think that is the thing. If you don't do anything, you are in the system and you haven't given yourself an opportunity to move outside the system.
The second pushback I get is that this is only for the privileged, right? Like, Mr. Money Mustache was an engineer, and like he's a white, able-bodied dude, and so that's the reason why. And this is not everyone can do this. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that privilege is real. And I think this lesson in particular, the one we spoke about today, is an example of how that's not necessarily a limiting factor. Yes, it gives you some advantages, but again, coming back to the numbers we used early in the show, if you're making $30,000 a year and only spending 20, then you're actually in a lot better shape than someone who's earning $100,000 a year and spending 98. So it's not just the engineers of the world. And I get it. There's a certain baseline cost of living that everybody has to have. And if you're not achieving income above that, then this probably isn't going to work for you. But you do have more control than you think about what that expenditure is. And if you manage it correctly, if you get your profit right, anyone can do it.
Any comments, Kim?
I think this is very doable on a modest income. Typically, I mean, like Paul said, maybe not below a certain baseline, but on a modest income where if you're already living, within your means or doing a bit of savings, then you're already somewhat practiced at not overspending or not spending excessively. And I think sometimes when people have a higher income, they just think they can make more money instead of maybe thinking about how to spend less of the money that they are already earning.
Yeah, that's so true, Kim. Like, I always tell my story. When I graduated from college, the first job I got was at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C., and I made $25,000 a year, and I spent 15. But I felt rich because in college I was poor. I lived on $5,000 a year. And so that first year, spending $15,000 was 3 times more than I did the year before. So I just decided, I don't know how, but at age 22, that financially, spiritually, environmentally, that if this was enough, I was drawing the line here. And for the next 20 years, I lived on about $25,000 a year. And that's how I was able to retire at age 42. I actually did the math. And during those 20 years, I only made $36,000 a year. But again, the difference between $36,000 and $20,000 was my savings rate. And that savings rate, when I invested it, created a margin for me. It created my 25x.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the other thing that I think is an important message to anyone who's considering something like this is there is no downside to being in a better financial position. You might think financial freedom is unattainable or a long way off in the future. And if you do use these tools and increase your profit and invest, etc., then you're in better shape.
But the pushback again on that, Paul, is sure, I could like scrimp and save now, but I want to live life now, right? Like that means I can't do things that I want to do, like live in a nicer house or travel or go to have really fun experiences. Any thoughts on that? Like what you're doing is you're sacrificing. And for young people, one, maybe they don't want to sacrifice because short-term thinking or because they despair about the future and they might as well just live now.
Yeah, I understand why people would say that. And I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is that you can still have fun and experiences just differently. There are plenty of ways to enjoy your life. And one of the things that I've realized is the experiences that matter are those that involve other people and connection and fulfillment in that kind of sense. The material stuff, again, I'll come back to the example of cars, right? Part of me did used to think that, yeah, I could save this money, but I want to buy that nice car, or I want to do this with a car, or whatever. And it was only after I took this class and really examined that I realized, yeah, I like doing that stuff. Of course I do. But I can still have fun in other ways that don't cost anywhere near as much money.
Oh, wow. This one just has so many components to it for me. I mean, part of what I think is that there have always been potential problems, catastrophes, uncertainties in the future. They existed in our generation when we were young, and they existed in our parents', generation. And in many cases, they actually had, very difficult things like depressions and world wars and that sort of thing. And I tend to agree with what Paul said, and that's that the things that really make a lasting impact and memories are interaction with people, emotion, the emotions that can be generated. And much of that can be done very, very simply, without necessarily having to, spend a lot of money on a big trip or, if anything, I sometimes feel like the technology has given us more opportunities to kind of have experiences without necessarily having to go to a place, for example, to have it. So I'll use a personal example. I'm never going to go to India. I love the food of India. I'd love to know more about the culture. I also know that that type of travel is particularly onerous and difficult for me. And so I'm going to appreciate some of the potential experience of that through other means, streaming, movies, videos, eating the cuisine, maybe talking to people who come from those cultures, but not necessarily going there.
You're talking about something really interesting, which is the difference between enjoying and having, right? Like I think in modern life, there's this sense, especially with social media and the availability of all these images, like if an experience is out there, I must experience it, as opposed to just being able to enjoy it without having to have it. The other thing that you brought up, Kim, is, yeah, I remember, we're the same generation. We grew up during the Cold War, and I don't think anyone, the younger generation, can really understand the existential dread living under nuclear annihilation felt like. And yet some people saved and some people didn't.
Yeah. Exactly.
We're coming on to our time. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience, either about the lesson or about your lives post-fire?
I think the only thing that I would do is reiterate what I said before, and that is I was genuinely surprised by how the financial freedom class made me think differently and gave me tools to take control of my life. I thought before we did the class that we were in a good position. We had a roof over our heads and food on the table and enough money coming in that we could save in our 401ks, and that's all that mattered. And the realization of how much more control I had and how many more tools I had to exercise that control was, as I said before, quite literally life-changing for me.
And I would just say this, and that's there's nothing wrong with being an outlier. I don't know what the percentages are of people who save so that they can accelerate their crossover to financial freedom. I imagine it might not be a super high percentage. So why not be one of those? And, still enjoy your life. Just find ways to do it that allow you to do so within the goals that you set for yourself. So some people might want it in 10 years. Some people might want it in 30.
Yeah, I think about it like, the most precious form of wealth we have in this life is time, right? Like we just have limited years in our life. And financial freedom is prioritizing that most precious form of wealth. Like I think about it like and I'm almost sure the two of you, like whatever difficulties we have post financial freedom, we would never return to an office job.
Not unless we had to.
Yeah. And that was just our baseline before doing it. Well, thank you both, Paul and Kim. I just really appreciate this conversation because, again, you two are like the first people that crossed over. So obviously you're like two of my favorite people that have ever taken the class.
Well, yes. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us on,
If
Douglas.
you find that the recording is, quality or anything like that is an issue and we need to do anything, just let us know. Okay. We're happy to.
All right. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in to the School of Financial Freedom podcast, where we ask, what does it mean to live a meaningful inner and outer life? And how do our personal finances fit into that? We hope you enjoyed this episode and it helps you live with an increasing sense of empowerment, integrity, and agency in the world. For more information, resources, and to re-listen to this or any past episodes, visit our website at schoolofinancialfreedom.com. There you can find out when the next cohort of Financial Freedom 1, the online course is. If you've enjoyed today's show, please consider leaving us a review, as it helps more people find us and join our community of people interested in the intersection of money and personal and spiritual growth. I'm Douglas Soy, founder of the School of Financial Freedom. You can also find me on Substack, where you can subscribe to my popular newsletter, Money and Meaning. I also love hearing from readers and listeners, so write me at www.douglassoy.com. I'm grateful that you listened, and I hope that this episode has given you hope and insight into taking control of your finances to live the life you want.